Hey guys, welcome back to our A-Push lectures, and today here we're going to do kind of the wrap up of our period 2 lessons. This will be the last one, and what I like about this is because it's a kind of a culminating factor where we kind of bring in all the different experiences, all the different aspects of colonial life of the 16th and 17th, I'm sorry, the 17th and 18th centuries, and we really kind of set ourselves up for period 3. We're going to go into all the main things that we need to talk about as far as European colonization. We're going to focus mostly on the British here, obviously. That's been the bulk of our talks here in period 2, talking about the different colonies such as the New England colonies, Chesapeake, and the Middle colonies once again. We will continue to kind of recap the transatlantic trade, how that kind of brought slavery to the British colonies and what that experience was like. Also, what the interactions were like between Native Americans and the various European colonies. And lastly, we'll take a little bit look at what kind of culture or colonial society looked like if you were to live here in this time frame. Come on. The first thing we're going to do here is just to kind of take a look at two different maps and kind of get a comparison to see how colonization has kind of transcended and evolved in the first 150 years or so of colonization here in the New World. And if we look here at this map, take a look at to what year we're here in the 17th century, roughly around 1660. As far as kind of where we are by the different European colonizations. Remember, we've seen Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands being the major four in this part of America, but they have not dived very deep. A lot of the Native Americans still control the heartland of the coast. The Europeans have basically just gotten onto the coast itself where they can trade, and we have like major colonies set up like here in Jamestown. We have Plymouth and Hartford and so forth in Boston. But other than that, there has not been a whole lot of colonization. We have the Spanish down here in Florida, and then obviously then the English colonizing most of the coast here, with the Dutch having the little piece here of New Amsterdam, eventually becoming New York, and the French are more here in the heartland. That's going to change though here, as we can see with the map now in the 17th century, around 1700 or so, 1750, that we have a little bit different. The British have definitely kind of cultivated a lot more land. They've really kind of broken into the heartland of the colonies here. Again, there is still that Appalachian Mountains that kind of divides them from the French. The French are more out here in the Midwest regions, and then all the way down to the south on the Gulf of Mexico with New Orleans. The Spanish still have Florida, and the Dutch have been completely kicked out of North America here, with New York now becoming what New Amsterdam once was, and that is now controlled by the British. And if we look here, we can see that the Native Americans by 1750 still drastically outweigh any particular group here of the English colonies. And if you notice here, just by the breakdown of it, there's a lot more in the New England as compared to like the back country. Talk about kind of the western part out near the Appalachian Mountains and so forth, the lower south of South Carolina and Georgia. There's a lot less populated. Pennsylvania and New York are still vastly populated compared to the likes of the other colonies. Philadelphia being such a major city, and then New York will eventually get there as well and take over as the largest city in the country once we have a United States. Now moving on to here, one of the other major topics here from period 2 that we need to focus on, which was topic 2.5, the interactions between American Indians and Europeans. One of the biggest things to keep in mind here was that we talked about each of the different colonization or European colonizers had different relationships with the Native Americans. We had the Spanish, who are a lot more of controlling, the French and the Dutch, who are a lot more adaptable and trying to learn from the Native Americans, and the British, who just wanted them to get the heck out of their way. And if we focus mostly on the British here, as we have with period 2, we know there's been a lot of conflicts between the Native Americans and British, especially over land. In the more of the New England colonies, especially with King Philip's War, Queen's Anne War, we have a whole bunch of different examples here of colonies that are trying to move and trying to further themselves westward while they're getting in the way of Native Americans' lands, and so they're competing for this land as well. As far as the French, as far as the Spanish, one of the things that they bring over, one of the triangular trades that kind of impact the Native Americans the most, would be the horses and livestock, because before the Europeans had arrived, the largest beast of burden, so the largest animal that was used for farming or used for labor, was the llama. There's not a whole lot of domestication of animals. Now, with the Europeans coming over, especially the Spanish, bringing over pigs, cattle, horses, they're going to drastically alter the way the Native Americans live, especially the horses, that allow for the plains culture kind of to take off with this nomadic hunting, especially in the herds of buffalo. And just to kind of take a quick little pit stop and look here what Spain is doing at the same time as what we've been talking about with the British colonies, it's important to keep in mind that the Spanish and the French especially never really take off population-wise the same way the British do. And because of this, they never really have a real solid foothold in North America. One, they don't have the population, they don't have the ability to trade the same way, they don't have the same way to protect themselves, and a lot of the lands that they have were just not as popular or not as inhabitable or not as, I guess, friendly for the Spanish citizens to come over to the New World. We also have a whole bunch of different revolts. The encomienda system is going to be revolted against. You have like the Pope's Revolt, which took place in the likes of modern-day New Mexico here around the Santa Fe region, that really kind of put an end to the encomienda systems in that area. Again, here then with the French settlements, we have a whole different aspect with that. Right around the time of the French and Indian War, you have a huge dramatic increase in reproduction as far as resources being converted or being produced. You have Jesuits who are converting Native Americans. Remember, we talked about the French were a lot more as far as follow me and learning from the Native Americans, so they had a lot friendlier relationship with them, and we'll see that when we get to the French and Indian War here in the next unit. Most of them are either fur traders, farmers, or working in the lumber industry, and they use the Mississippi River. You can see that they colonized all this land here down the Missouri Mississippi River to kind of create a port here in New Orleans, or present-day Louisiana, as a way to kind of make profit again through that mercantilist system. And it's important to keep in mind here that as we start to kind of move back into the British colonies, there's a lot of growth and diversity happening here in the 1700s. This is really kind of the hay period of colonization, right as a precursor of the French and Indian War and then of the Revolutionary War. And a lot of this is kind of booming because people in Europe see that it's successful. The people in the New World finally have their own land. They have their own chance to kind of fulfill their dreams, to make something of themselves, to have their own piece of land, to have their own business. So you have huge economic growth. You have increased birth rates, falling death rates, so that people are just healthier here in the New World as well. And we even have different political and religious ideas being pushed out here with the likes of the Great Awakening, and then also that of the Enlightenment period that's kind of rubbing off on the colonists here in the New World. Again, that sense of salutary neglect allows for them to have these ideas and this growth in the New World. You can see the different ethnic groups and kind of where they are settling in the enclaves that they create here in the New World by North America. And this is around 1770, where you have different areas of Scots-Irish, you have English, you have the Dutch here in certain areas, African here, obviously in the more the deeper South, and then also German here in the kind of middle part of America, especially in Pennsylvania. Here are just some statistics here kind of showing the immigration that's coming over to the New World. Obviously, about 50% of them are going to be English, with them being English colonies. You have the largest ethnic group being that of African slaves. You have millions of slaves being forced over against their will via the Middle Passage. And you also even have just examples of like the Transportation Act, which are kind of allowing judges to send over criminals. We think of that kind of historically with Australia as a place for refuges for convicts, but this is also happening here in North America too. As I mentioned when we were looking at the map here, we have different ethnic groups like the Scots-Irish that are coming over to the frontiers part. You have the Germans, who are really the second largest group to emigrate from Europe, who are seeing kind of these hard-working Anglican farmers. Again, a lot of these cultures being that of the WASPs, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. We will see a shift in this when we get to the late 1800s, really kind of period 6 and period 7 in our studies. We'll see a shift where more immigration is coming over from Eastern Europe, but for now we're focusing mostly on Western Europe here. Again, one of our other biggest ideas here from this would have been the idea of the transatlantic trade, and these economies are developing because of the triangular trade. And not to beat the horse too much, but hopefully remember these words of mercantilism that are really kind of setting up an economy base where the mother country is being controlling colonies to make them profit and to make them money, and then in turn they are sending raw materials back to the mother country to create finished goods. Again, we went If you don't remember this chart, go back. I explained this in one of our previous videos. And because of this increase in triangular trade, we talked about one of the biggest impacts was the increase of slave culture happening in the colonies. A lot of the colonies are all based on the importation of slavery. Even the northern colonies have slaves to some extent, much smaller than that of the southern colonies. But because of this increase in economy, it allows to one of the major themes here is that it's going to allow for an increased standard of living. People are more affluent for the most part in North America than they are of that in Europe. And that's why there's also thinking about cause and effect, push and pull factors. That's what's bringing so many immigrants to the New World is that chance at a better life. And this increased mercantilism is going to increase demand for different American products like tobacco, like sugar, like wheat and corn and fish and so forth. And because of this, it kind of creates a new consumerism. Okay, the desire for colonists to have these home goods or to have their own houses and to have their own stuff, things that they hadn't had before. Now, if we want to talk about how there might be a negative, one of the negatives here, and we talk about the Navigation Act as well, it kind of put a restriction on what colonists were able to trade and how they were able to trade. Many colonists who are in the business of products are falling into debt from the English merchants. A lot of these people who are falling debt to merchants live in these larger cities. We see a kind of a growth in certain cities. However, it does stay contained. Only about 5% of the colonial population lives in these major cities, but these are the major cities of Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston, Newport, New York. The reason why they're so more heavily populated, obviously, is because of the proximity to water ports for trade. But there is still a lot who are kind of moving out westward towards the back country and kind of get away from that. All right, so one of the last themes here being the 18th century or 1700s American politics. And remember that key term to remember is salutary neglect, meaning that the American or the British colonies were not caring so much about what was happening in the New World as long as they were making them profit. And what that allowed for was that the English colonies were able to kind of run themselves. And even though they almost all have royal governors, a lot of them are weak. A lot of all colonies had, hey, how you doing? All of the colonies had colonial assemblies that were in charge of taxation, were in charge of creating laws. They were not necessarily democratic. They were kind of centralized. They were mostly controlled by the wealthy and the elite, so it was not the same way we kind of think like the House of Representatives today. But this legacy of salutary neglect is going to bleed off into eventually after the French and Indian War, these feelings of leaving us alone, the colonies having their own sense of identity and wanting to break away with the American Revolution. And here we can just kind of see these patterns that are kind of, and these are not true for all, but for most, as far as who is in control and what their jobs are. Again, most of the colonies having these royal governors who are appointed by the King of England. However, most of them are either incompetent or just they're more figureheads. Kind of think about like the Queen of England today. She has no impact on policy or laws and so forth. She is there as a figurehead to kind of as tradition to kind of look good for the country. You then have these governors' councils who advise the governor and so forth, but they don't really represent anybody. And then the colonial assemblies are a lot where the laws and taxation ideas are coming from. And it's important to keep in mind here, although we don't have a direct democracy, there is still voting taking place with these, and very similar to that of the House of Commons, again, the House of Burgess in Virginia and so forth, where these democratic assemblies are kind of coming together to form laws. And the last topic here we're going to talk about very, very briefly is going to be the Great Awakening. We're not going to get into huge depth with this again because we've already talked about it. However, remember that there was a kind of a falling back of religion in the New World. People are no longer going to church. People don't really see religion as a necessity, and this is going to be revived here with the Great Awakening and the teachings of George Whitefield, of Jonathan Edwards. And these fire and passiony sermons are allowing people to kind of go back and reflect on their own salvation and so forth. And if you need to go back and think about a deeper context to this, again, go back and read your book or go back and listen to one of our previous videos. So guys, this is going to wrap up our last video here in period 2. We covered a whole heck of a lot, going all the way from the different regions of the colonies all the way through transatlantic trade, Native American policies, slavery, and also religion here in the New World. If you have any questions, please bring them to me so we can go over them before our last class, before our test, and I will see you then